There is an uncomfortable truth that is rarely spoken out loud. Many people do not know how to live without suffering. They seek it unconsciously. They feed it in silence. They make it part of their identity, as if it were an inevitable shadow. And the most disturbing part of all is that, even though they appear to hate it, deep down they seem to need it in order to feel alive. Perhaps you have asked yourself at some point why, when things begin to improve in your life, a voice suddenly arises within you, reminding you of your past mistakes, your failures, your wounds, as if your own mind could not bear the idea of living in peace. It is as if there were an invisible addiction, a tendency to return to that dark place you already know well, pain. And although you rationalize it by saying that it is part of life, the reality is that you seek it even when you could let it go. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you prolonged in your mind an argument that was already over? How many nights have you relived painful memories that could add nothing to your present? How many times have you told yourself the same victim story, convinced that the world is against you? Suffering then becomes a habit, a routine so automatic that it almost seems natural, but it is not. The Stoics knew this well. They said that real pain is inevitable, but prolonged suffering is optional. What is inevitable is losing, making mistakes, falling ill, growing old. That is part of the destiny no one controls. But what does depend on us is how we interpret those events, what meaning we assign them, what place we allow them to occupy in our lives. And here lies the trap. When you confuse suffering with your identity, you end up living to keep it alive, even when there is no longer any reason to do so. The problem is that this addiction to suffering is rarely recognized as such. No one goes through life saying, "I am addicted to pain." Instead, it hides behind common phrases such as, "That's just who I am." "The same thing always happens to me," "I have no luck," or "I'll never get out of this." The language we use reveals the invisible chains with which we tie ourselves to misfortune, and the more we repeat those narratives, the deeper the grooves become in our minds. But the most striking thing is that addictive suffering not only destroys inner peace, it also conditions our decisions. The one who is trapped in this circle relates from fear, seeks jobs that confirm his sense of insufficiency, maintains relationships that perpetuate his wounds, and rejects opportunities that could give him freedom. Pain becomes a compass, although its direction always leads to the same place, the loss of oneself. The Stoics proposed a different path. Marcus Aurelius said, "The life of a man is what his thoughts make of it." If your thoughts feed on suffering, your entire life will be a reflection of it. If you learn to direct your mind toward virtue, serenity and control over what depends on you, suffering loses its power. Pain does not disappear because that is beyond your control, but the addiction to it does. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to live without that need to return again and again to the same dark place. Imagine what it would mean to wake up each day without reliving the mistakes of the past, without unconsciously searching for new reasons to feel like a victim, without turning pain into a permanent altar in your mind. Freedom would not mean the absence of problems, but rather the ability to face them with serenity, to learn from them, and to move forward without dragging invisible chains. That is the proposal of this journey, to discover how suffering has become a secret addiction in your life, to recognize its hidden mechanisms, and above all, to learn how to break them with the help of Stoic philosophy. It is not about denying what hurts, nor about living in an illusion of artificial happiness. It is about reclaiming the power to decide what place pain occupies in your story. And here appears the confrontation you must face. Much of your suffering may not be caused by what you live, but by what you repeat in your mind. It may be that you yourself, without realizing it, keep the wound alive. It may be that the addiction is not in the circumstances, but in the interpretation you choose each day. And if that is true, then it is also true that you can free yourself. Stay until the end of this journey, because what you will discover in each Stoic lesson is not a simple self-help tip, but a direct confrontation with that part of you that has made pain into a habit. You will learn to distinguish between useful and useless suffering, between the pain that strengthens and the one that only destroys, between freedom and emotional slavery. Suffering is not your destiny. Suffering is not your identity. Suffering is not your eternal chain. It is only an interpretation, a habit that can be broken, an addiction that can be healed. And this journey begins here. Before we begin, I want you to declare your commitment by leaving in the comments, "I am stronger than my suffering. I choose my freedom." That phrase will be your reminder that you did not come here to remain chained to pain, but to break it. That you are not destined to relive past wounds, but to live with dignity and serenity. This is the moment to prove to yourself that you can let go of what is already over and walk lightly toward your true inner strength. Without further delay, let us begin. First Stoic lesson. Suffering can also become a habit. Suffering does not always arrive as an unexpected visitor. Sometimes we turn it into a permanent guest. Without realizing it, we open the door, prepare a place for it in our mind, and end up welcoming it every day, as if it were part of our routine. Habit is a powerful force, and when the mind grows accustomed to pain, it begins to seek it even in the absence of real reasons. At that point, suffering ceases to be a natural reaction to difficulties and transforms into a silent habit. Imagine someone who, after a painful breakup, decides to isolate themselves. At first, that isolation may seem necessary for healing, but over time it becomes a refuge, a kind of mental cave where that person feels protected from the risk of being hurt again. What began as a defense mechanism ends up being a prison. When the opportunity for new love arises, that person rejects it, not because the other is harmful, but because their mind has already become used to living in the safety of suffering. That is the trap of habit. It disguises itself as protection, when in reality it prolongs the pain. The Stoics warned of this clearly. Seneca wrote that the habits of the soul are harder to break than those of the body. A person can quit smoking, change their diet, or alter their exercise routine, but how does one break with an invisible custom that happens in the mind? Habitual suffering operates like internal programming. It is as if the mind, over and over again, gives the command to return to the same dark place simply because it recognizes it as familiar. And the familiar always seems safer than the unknown, even when the familiar hurts. The habit of suffering also manifests in everyday language. When someone says, "The same thing always happens to me," they are reinforcing that narrative. Every time they repeat the story of their failure, they make it more real. Every time they define themselves as a victim, they strengthen the chains that bind them. The mind, upon hearing these words, takes them as commands and begins to confirm what has already been said. In this way, the habit reinforces itself and becomes even harder to break. But there is something even deeper. Many people confuse suffering with authenticity. They believe that if it does not hurt, it is not real. They think relationships must be filled with conflict, that work must be plagued with unbearable sacrifices, that life is only validated when extreme trials are endured. That mentality turns pain into the norm, and when there is no suffering, one unconsciously looks for a reason to bring it back, because the mind no longer knows how to live without it. Epictetus taught that freedom begins with mastery of oneself. But how can one master themselves if they are enslaved by their own mental habits? The Stoic answer was not to deny pain, but to learn to observe it without making it a custom, to observe it as a visitor who comes and goes, not as a companion to whom we swear eternal loyalty. Suffering may knock on your door, but you do not have to invite it to live with you. In practice, breaking the habit of suffering first requires recognizing it. Ask yourself honestly, am I clinging to pain because it has become my comfort zone? Am I repeating thoughts that reinforce my identity as a victim? Do I feel strange when things go well, as if something bad has to happen to balance the scales? These questions are the beginning of the break, because they reveal what was previously hidden. Life offers countless examples of how this habit operates. A person who loses a job may, instead of seeing the opportunity to reinvent themselves, repeat for years that they were treated unfairly. That thought becomes a dark mantra that guides all their later decisions. Another person who suffered betrayal in love may assume that all people are traitors, closing their heart and confirming with each rejection the narrative they themselves chose to keep alive. In both cases, the initial pain is real, but what prolongs it is the habit. The Stoics proposed a powerful mental exercise to distinguish between what depends on you and what does not. The initial pain, the loss, the wound, the betrayal, does not depend on you. It happened, and you could not prevent it. But the prolonged suffering, the mental repetition, the constant complaint, the endless rewriting of the same story, does depend on you. That is your decision. Each time you choose to repeat the narrative of pain, you are reinforcing the habit. Each time you choose to interrupt it, even with a small alternative thought, you are weakening the chain. Breaking the habit of suffering is not simple. No one abandons overnight a custom that has been cultivated for years. It requires discipline, constant vigilance of thoughts, and above all, courage. Courage to face the discomfort that arises when you decide to live without the company of pain. Because yes, paradoxically, habitual pain becomes company, a presence that, though bothersome, gives the sensation of security. Letting it go can feel like losing a part of yourself. But that feeling is deceptive. What you are really losing is the chain that kept you bound. Here, Stoicism offers a clear path. Every time the habit of suffering tries to impose itself, remember that you are not obliged to obey it. Seneca said that the wise man endures what he cannot change and changes what is within his power. You cannot change what happened, but you can change your relationship to it. You cannot prevent pain from knocking on your door, but you can prevent it from settling in. The practical application is simple, but powerful. When you notice that you are mentally repeating a past wound, stop, breathe. Tell yourself, this is no longer happening. I am only reliving it in my mind. That short phrase interrupts the cycle. It does not erase the memory, but it prevents the memory from becoming present suffering. Practice this interruption again and again, and little by little you will notice the power of the habit weakening. This is how true freedom begins, not when you eliminate all pain from your life, because that is impossible, but when you stop making suffering your daily custom. Pain is inevitable. The habit of suffering is not. Recognizing this difference is taking the first step toward a more serene and conscious existence. Second Stoic lesson. Chosen pain is different from imposed pain. Not all pains are the same. Some come as inevitable blows of life, the loss of a loved one, the betrayal of someone you trusted, an illness you did not ask for, an accident you did not seek. That pain is imposed. It bursts into your path without you having chosen it. But there is another kind of pain, one that does not come from fate or fatality, but from your own decision. It is chosen pain, the one you accept voluntarily, because you know that behind it there is a greater purpose, to grow, to become stronger, to reach a higher good. The Stoics understood this difference clearly. Seneca said that it is not the weight of the burden that destroys man, but carrying it without meaning, and it is true. The same pain can be experienced as torture or as discipline, depending on the interpretation you give it. Imposed pain crushes because it has no direction. Chosen pain strengthens because it becomes a teacher. Let us think of a simple example: physical training. Anyone who has lifted weights, run long distances, or practiced a sport in a disciplined way knows the muscular pain, the fatigue, the exhaustion that accompanies effort. That pain is real, but it is chosen pain. You accept it because you know that on the other side, strength, endurance, and health await you. The same pain, if imposed by an illness, would be devastating, but when you choose it, it becomes a tool for growth. Life is full of similar situations: waking up early to study when you would rather sleep, giving up an immediate pleasure to save for a greater purpose, remaining silent in the face of an offense instead of exploding in anger. Each of these decisions contains a dose of discomfort, of small but real pain, which you choose to endure in order to obtain a greater good. That is the pain that ennobles, because it is not a punishment, but a conscious path. In contrast, imposed pain is the one you tolerate passively. It is staying in a toxic relationship without making decisions. It is enduring a job that destroys your emotional health without daring to change. It is carrying old resentments that consume you inside without seeking to heal them. That pain does not teach, does not build, does not elevate you. It only wears you down. And yet, many keep it alive because they have convinced themselves that they have no other choice. Epictetus expressed it clearly. It is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinion we have of them. When you choose pain with a purpose, your opinion transforms it into discipline. When you endure it without reason, your opinion turns it into torment. The key is not only in what happens, but in how you interpret that pain and what you decide to do with it. The problem is that many times we confuse these two types of pain. We believe that enduring any suffering is a sign of strength, when in reality it can be a sign of resignation. There are those who pride themselves on how much pain they can endure, as if resistance without purpose were a merit in itself. But Stoicism does not exalt the martyr who suffers for the sake of suffering, but the wise man who distinguishes which pains are worth it and which are pure loss. Imagine a man who remains for decades in a job he detests, justifying himself with phrases like, "It's what I got," or "That's life." That pain is imposed and worse, prolonged by his own passivity. Now think of another man who, with the same discomfort, decides to start his own project. The process demands sacrifices, sleepless nights, financial insecurity, but that chosen pain transforms him. One consumes himself in a routine that slowly kills him. The other strengthens himself in a battle he chose to fight. The Stoics teach us to value chosen pain as an essential part of virtue. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, reminded himself every day that life would present trials and that he must face them with discipline. For him, the voluntary pain of discipline, the effort to control his thoughts, to govern his emotions, to act with justice even when he did not feel like it, was a small price to pay for the greatness of the soul. In practice, the distinction is clear. Imposed pain finds you, chosen pain you seek. The first drags you, the second you lead. The first steals energy, the second invests it. The first enslaves, the second liberates. The question then is not whether you will have pain in life, because that is inevitable, but what kind of pain you will accept. Chosen pain has another essential characteristic. It is limited. You suffer in the gym, but only for an hour. You feel discomfort when saying no to a temptation, but then you feel the satisfaction of discipline. In contrast, imposed pain can be infinite, a complaint that never ends, a resentment that accompanies you all your life, a wound that reopens every time you remember it. That is why choosing the right pain is an act of intelligence, not of masochism. How to apply this Stoic teaching? Start by sincerely distinguishing the pains in your life. Ask yourself this question: did I choose this pain with a purpose, or do I simply endure it because I resigned myself? If the answer is the latter, you have the responsibility to decide whether you will continue to carry it or whether you will take steps to free yourself. Perhaps that means leaving a relationship, changing jobs, healing a wound, dropping an excuse. You cannot avoid the imposed pain that has already occurred, but you can avoid perpetuating it. Chosen pain, on the other hand, is a sign of progress. When you decide to study instead of distract yourself, you accept the momentary pain of concentration to reap the fruit of knowledge. When you choose to save instead of spend, you accept the pain of renunciation to enjoy future freedom. When you decide to remain calm in the face of provocation, you accept the pain of suppressing your immediate impulse to cultivate your serenity. That is the path of the wise, to suffer for what is worthwhile. The Stoic habit consists of training yourself every day to distinguish between the two. Ask yourself, does this pain bring me closer to virtue, to serenity, to freedom? If the answer is yes, then accept it with dignity. If the answer is no, then release it firmly. That decision, though simple in words, requires courage in action. But it is that courage that marks the difference between the slave and the free, between the one who consumes himself in suffering and the one who strengthens himself in discipline. In the end, life is not measured by how much pain you endured, but by what you did with that pain. Imposed pain can destroy you, but it can also become a seed if you decide to transform it. Chosen pain, on the other hand, always leaves a trace of growth. And when you learn to live with this clear distinction, you no longer fear suffering, because you know that not all pain is an enemy. Some pains are, in reality, allies in disguise. Third Stoic lesson: do not confuse suffering with identity. There are pains that mark us, wounds that seem to divide life into a before and an after. And it is true, there are experiences that transform us forever, but it is something very different to turn those wounds into your only identity, into the mirror with which you present yourself to the world and with which you look at yourself every morning. That is one of the cruelest traps of suffering, making you believe that you are your pain. Many live like this. They say, I am the one who was betrayed. I am the one who was abandoned. I am the one who failed. They draft their biography based on what they lost, as if there were nothing else worthy of being told. Suffering then becomes a label, a mask, a uniform. And the problem with those masks is that they end up glued to the face. You forget who you were before the blow, and you no longer know who you could be afterwards. Marcus Aurelius made it clear in his Meditations, your essence is not what you endure, but the virtue with which you respond. What defines you is not what happened to you, but what you decided to do with it. A wound can be a scar you remember with gratitude for what you learned, or it can be a chain you drag all your life. The difference is not in the wound itself, but in the interpretation you choose. Imagine two people who lived through the same abandonment. One clings to that story for years, always describing themselves as the person who was left behind, and seeing in every relationship a reflection of that trauma. The other, although feeling the same initial pain, decides to rebuild, to learn from the experience, and to open up to life again. Both suffered, but one became a slave to the wound, and the other transformed it into a lesson. That contrast shows what the Stoics repeated. You do not control what happens to you, but you do control what place you give it in your soul. The risk of confusing suffering with identity is that you end up building your life around pain. You make decisions from it. You relate from it. You even seek recognition through it. Suffering becomes a shield with which you justify your fears. I don't trust anyone because I was betrayed. I don't try anything new because I failed once. I don't deserve happiness because I already suffered too much. Pain, which at first was a circumstance, becomes a permanent excuse. Stoicism offers a radical antidote. Separate who you are from what you suffer. Epictetus, who was a slave for much of his life, taught that they could chain his body, but not his spirit. If he, in the midst of slavery, could understand that his identity was not defined by the suffering imposed upon him, what prevents us from doing the same? Pain is real, but your identity is greater than any wound. Language reveals a lot. When someone says, I am a failure, they are not describing an isolated fact. They are declaring an identity. It is one thing to say, I failed in this project, and quite another to define oneself as a failure. The first points to an event, The second becomes a sentence, and the mind, when it hears those absolute definitions, takes them as orders. Little by little, it begins to behave according to them. Think of someone who lost a business. If they define themselves as an entrepreneur who learned a lesson, they have an open path to try again. If they define themselves as a failure, they slam shut all future doors. The difference is not in what happened, but in the identity they chose to build from it. Suffering can also become a collective identity. There are families who transmit from generation to generation the idea that we are poor, we are victims, we are the ones who never have luck. That shared discourse becomes inheritance, part of the blood. The Stoics would have pointed out that it is not about denying adversity, but about not allowing it to define the essence. What you are goes beyond what you suffer, even if you have carried difficulties all your life. In practice, how do you break this confusion? The first step is to observe your own language. Ask yourself, am I describing what happened, or am I defining myself by it? Am I recounting a fact, or am I using that fact to chain my identity? That distinction is fundamental. Every time you say I am, followed by your pain, stop. Change it for a story that gives you back your power. Do not say, I am a victim of betrayal. Say, I lived through a betrayal and I learned from it. That small change changes your narrative, and your narrative changes your life. The second step is to cultivate different examples in your memory. Remember moments when your identity was tied to virtue, not pain. The time you acted with courage, the time you were generous, the time you remained serene in the midst of the storm. Those moments are also part of your story, but the habit of suffering often eclipses them. Choose to bring them into consciousness because they are also you. The third step is to accept that your pain is part of your biography, but it is not your definition. A scar on your skin tells a story, but it does not explain your entire life. In the same way, an emotional wound marks a chapter, but it is not the whole book. It is not about denying what happened, but about placing it in the right place, as experience, not as identity. Marcus Aurelius advised looking at oneself every morning and asking, what virtue can I practice today? That is the way to shift the center of identity, not in what you suffered yesterday, but in what you decide to cultivate today. Virtue, not pain, is what shapes your true self. When you achieve this separation, suffering ceases to be a chain and becomes a lesson. It ceases to be a mirror that distorts your image and becomes a memory that strengthens your character. You no longer need to present yourself as the one who suffered, because your essence shines beyond the wound. And that is where true freedom begins. When you stop living as a walking wound and start living as a complete human being, capable of virtue, love, and serenity. You are not what happened to you. You are not the betrayal, the failure, the loss. You are what you did, what you learned, what you continue to build despite everything. Suffering may accompany you in memory, but it has no right to occupy your identity. That depends only on you. Fourth Stoic lesson: suffering without action is pure loss. Suffering by itself has no value. Hurting is not synonymous with growing. Enduring is no guarantee of learning. Pain can become a teacher, but it can also become an executioner. The difference lies in what you do with it. If you use it to transform yourself, suffering serves a purpose. If you passively endure it without extracting anything from it, then it is pure loss. A useless drain, a weight that drags you down without leaving you any lesson. The Stoics were clear about this. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Pain is not an evil in itself, but yielding to it is." Pain, inevitable in life, only turns into virtue if you transform it into action, if you use it as material to forge character, discipline, and wisdom. Otherwise, it is nothing but empty torment. Think of someone who has spent years lamenting a betrayal. The wound was real, but what have they done with it? If they repeat it every day, if they turn it into an excuse to distrust everyone, if they cling to that wound as a reason not to love again, then that suffering produced nothing of value. It is pure waste. But if that same person decides to learn from the experience, to better discern whom to trust, to cultivate patience and clarity in their relationships, then suffering, although painful, becomes a teacher. Suffering without action is like planting a seed and never watering it. The pain is there, like tilled soil, like an opportunity for growth. But if you do nothing, that seed dies. That is why so many people feel that life has taken more from them than it has given, because they never took what hurt and turned it into wisdom. Epictetus expressed it bluntly. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Reaction is the key. Suffering is not a choice, but your response is. When you don't respond, when you limit yourself to passively enduring what happened, you let suffering be in vain. But when you respond with action, pain becomes the foundation of a stronger life. Human history is full of examples of people who transformed suffering into action. Think of the philosophers who, from prison, wrote reflections that still enlighten us today. Think of those who, after losing everything, founded projects that changed lives. Think of those who, after a tragedy, decided to dedicate their lives to preventing others from going through the same. Pain itself did not make them great. It was what they did with it. The problem for many is that they confuse enduring with learning. They believe that the more they suffer, the more merit they have. But it's not so. Suffering without action does not ennoble, it degrades. Only conscious action turns pain into virtue. Enduring without transforming is staying in the same place, bleeding without healing, repeating without evolving. Imagine someone who loses their job. The pain is real, the uncertainty, the wound to pride, the worry about the future. If that person limits themselves to lamenting, to complaining, to repeating that life is unfair, then that suffering is wasted. But if they decide to use that pain as fuel to reinvent themselves, acquire new skills, or find a greater purpose, then the loss becomes an opportunity. Action transforms the wound into a path. Suffering without action also hides in the habit of complaining. Every time you repeat a painful story without purpose, you are reinforcing an empty cycle. Complaining prolongs suffering, but does not transform it. The Stoics warned against this. They said that the wise man does not waste words on useless laments, but acts on what is within his control. Action is the true language of transformation. In practice, how can this teaching be applied? The key is to ask a simple question every time you go through pain. What can I learn or do with this? That short question turns the experience into an active challenge. Instead of getting stuck in, why me, you move to, what will I do now? That mental shift is the essence of Stoicism, not denying suffering, but turning it into a school. Action does not always have to be grand. Sometimes it is small, getting out of bed despite sadness, asking for help, writing what you feel, making a difficult decision. The important thing is not to remain immobile. Suffering without action stagnates. Action opens paths. Even the smallest decision, if born from pain, can become the beginning of transformation. Marcus Aurelius said that the universe does not conspire against you, but simply follows its course. What happens is beyond your control, but what you do with it is in your hands. That is the difference between living as a victim of suffering or as a learner of life. Suffering without action is pure loss, but suffering with action becomes virtue. When you understand this, you no longer seek to avoid all pain, because that is impossible, but to make use of it. You don't ask, why did I suffer? But, what will I do with what I suffered? That question is what divides those who sink from those who rise. Pain comes to everyone, but not everyone turns it into a teacher. In the end, the choice is yours. Will you let your suffering be a waste, or will you use it as material to build your strength? The Stoics did not seek to escape pain, but neither did they worship it. They faced it, accepted it, and transformed it into action. That is true wisdom, not accumulating wounds, but cultivating lessons. Remember this: suffering does not make you better. Acting from your suffering does. Pain without action is empty. Pain transformed is virtue, and that choice is always in your hands. Fifth Stoic lesson: pleasure in suffering is a trap. Suffering, when prolonged, can become a strange place, painful yet familiar. And the familiar, even when it hurts, can come to give a sense of hidden pleasure. Not pleasure in the sense of conscious enjoyment, but in the form of a perverse relief, feeling special for suffering more than others, feeling entitled to compassion, always having an excuse that justifies inaction. That is one of the deepest traps of suffering, pride disguised as pain. There are those who, without realizing it, turn their wounds into medals. They speak again and again of what they endured, not to heal, but to stand out. They make suffering into a stage where they are the protagonists, waiting for admiration or pity from others. Their pain becomes a form of privileged identity. I have suffered more than you, therefore I deserve more attention, more care, more respect. But that illusion does not free, it enslaves. The Stoics looked upon this tendency with suspicion. Seneca warned that suffering without virtue is only vanity. There is no merit in enduring useless pains and then displaying them as trophies. The greatness of the wise does not lie in how much they have suffered, but in how they have responded. Suffering does not make you virtuous by itself. What makes it virtue is the serenity with which you face it and the wisdom you extract from it. The pleasure in suffering is dangerous because it acts like any addiction. At first, it seems to give you something: attention, recognition, identity. But over time, it steals your freedom. You grow so accustomed to the victim's role that you fear losing it. You no longer want to release the pain because if you do, who would you be? Suffering becomes your banner, and letting it go would feel like losing your only place in the world. Let's think of an everyday example. Imagine someone who lived a difficult childhood and years later continues recounting every detail as if it was still happening. Their friends listen, console, and understand them. That compassion feels good. It gives them a place in the group. But at some point, without realizing it, they stop seeking to heal and start seeking to relive. They no longer tell their story to free themselves, but to feed the attention they receive. That is the hidden pleasure of suffering, the sensation of being seen, even if only through pain. The same happens in relationships. Some use pain as a form of power. "Look at all I have suffered for you," they say, expecting the other person to be trapped in guilt. In this way, suffering becomes a tool of manipulation, a currency of emotional exchange. The goal is not to overcome the wound, but to keep it alive, to maintain a position. That is not strength, it is dependence in disguise. Pleasure in suffering also appears in the silent pride of those who boast about enduring more than others. "Nobody knows what I've been through," they say, as if merely suffering were an accomplishment. But Marcus Aurelius would have questioned that. What matters is not how many trials you endured, but with what virtue you faced them. Suffering is not a competition. There is no medal for who has cried the most. True dignity lies not in accumulated pain, but in cultivated serenity. The problem with this trap is that it perpetuates suffering. Like any addiction, it always asks for more. If pain gives me identity, then unconsciously I will seek new pains to reaffirm my role. If suffering gives me attention, unconsciously I will know I must keep the wound open to continue receiving it. Thus, the cycle never ends. The pain renews itself, not because life imposes it, but because I feed it myself. Epictetus offered a direct antidote. Do not seek to be admired for what you suffer, but for what you do with what you suffer. Stoicism does not invite you to deny pain, but it does oblige you to ask, am I using my suffering to grow, or am I using it as an excuse, as a banner, as a form of recognition? That uncomfortable question unmasks the hidden pleasure in suffering. In practice, how do you break this trap? First, by recognizing that it exists. Admitting that there is a part of you that perhaps enjoys the role of victim is not easy, but it is necessary. Then, by shifting your identity from pain to virtue. Instead of presenting yourself as the one who suffered, begin to build yourself as the one who learned. Instead of repeating your wound, begin narrating your transformation. That transition breaks the dark circle that binds you to suffering. It also helps to change the way you seek connection with others. If you always use your pain as the meeting point, you will only attract relationships based on pity. But if you share your virtues, your lessons, your serenity, you will attract relationships built on genuine admiration. Suffering should not be your introduction card, because it is not what defines you. What defines you is the strength with which you keep moving forward. Pleasure in suffering is, in the end, a dangerous lie. It promises identity, but steals freedom. It promises attention, but steals serenity. It promises worth, but steals dignity. The Stoics knew there is no glory in suffering for suffering's sake. The glory lies in transforming suffering into virtue and then moving forward without turning it into an altar. True greatness is not measured in how many times you cried, but in how many times you rose. It is not in how much pain you accumulated, but in how much serenity you cultivated. If you fall into the trap of pleasure in suffering, you will live eternally in the wound. If you choose to leave it, you will discover that freedom tastes better than any fleeting recognition. Remember, suffering is not a stage for your vanity. It is a visitor that arrives, leaves a lesson, and must depart. Do not make it your home or your flag, otherwise you will have traded your freedom for a trap disguised as pleasure, and there is no greater loss than that. Clinging to suffering does not mean you are weak. It only means you are ready to free yourself from that silent addiction that robs you of peace. If you have ever felt that pain became a habit in your life, subscribing may seem like a small gesture, but for us, it means everything. It allows us to continue creating this space where suffering ceases to be your identity and becomes your teacher. Here you will learn to release the invisible chains that bind you and to recover the inner freedom that has always been within you. Your pain is not your destiny. It is the beginning of your strength. Sixth Stoic lesson: do not prolong the pain that has already ended. Pain, when it strikes, comes with force. A loss, a betrayal, a failure, an illness. In the moment it happens, the wound is inevitable. No one is exempt from crying, from suffering, from feeling the anguish that the unexpected brings. But one thing is to experience that pain when it occurs, and another very different thing is to prolong it beyond its natural time. Many people keep carrying wounds that have already closed, as if they needed to open them over and over again. They live in the past, constantly remembering what can no longer be changed, and thus they multiply their suffering. Epictetus said it plainly: of what has already happened, nothing depends on you. The only thing within your power is your attitude toward the present. Yet it is common to see how the mind clings to what is no longer here, to what has ended, as if repeating it could give it some meaning. It is like bleeding from a wound that has already healed. There is no need, but we do it with each memory, with each inner narration that brings us back to the pain again and again. Let us think of an example. A person was publicly humiliated years ago. The wound was real. They felt shame, anger, helplessness. But years have passed, and still, every night they relive the scene in their mind. They replay every word, imagine responses they never gave, build dialogues that never existed. Each repetition reopens the wound. The event happened only once, but in their memory it happens 1,000 more times. That is prolonged suffering, the kind that no longer comes from the present, but from memory. The past can become a prison if we make it our permanent residence. And the cruelest part is that no one else holds the key. Only we keep the door locked, clinging to memories that have already served their time. Marcus Aurelius warned, "Man lives only in the present, because the past is gone and the future has not yet come." Yet we insist on dragging the past as if it were an obligatory part of our identity. Why do we do this? Because the memory of pain gives us a sense of control. We believe that if we repeat it, we can understand it better, prevent it from happening again, even find justice where there was none. But in reality, all we achieve is to prolong a suffering that has already ended. Reliving the past does not change it. It only makes it heavier. Prolonged suffering can also disguise itself as loyalty. Some people feel that if they stop suffering for someone they lost, they are betraying their memory, as if healing meant forgetting. But Stoicism offers a different vision. To honor the past is not to repeat its pain, but to live with dignity what you still have. Not prolonging suffering is not a lack of love. It is recognizing that life goes on and that the best way to honor what was is to make the most of what is. Imagine a person who lost someone close. During the first months, the pain is inevitable. The absence weighs, the emptiness hurts, but if years later they are still clinging to the same suffering, not allowing themselves to laugh, not allowing themselves to love, not allowing themselves to live, then that pain is no longer memory, but chain. The initial wound was inevitable. The prolongation is a choice. The Stoics knew that memory can be a blessing or a curse. A blessing when we remember what inspires us, what makes us grateful, what drives us to virtue. A curse when we chain ourselves to memories of past wounds, replaying scenes that now exist only in our mind. Memory should not be an executioner. It must be a teacher. In practice, breaking free from prolonged suffering requires a conscious exercise, placing each pain in its rightful place. Ask yourself, is this pain still happening, or am I just keeping it alive in my mind? If it is no longer happening, then the pain you feel is not real. It is recreated. Do not deny the wound, but do not feed it either. Tell yourself, this has already passed. I do not need to relive it. That act of recognition cuts the cycle of repetition. You can also practice the Stoic exercise of attention to the present. Each time your mind drifts toward the painful memory, bring it back to what you have today. Observe what is happening around you, the people you share with, the air you breathe, the opportunities before you. The present does not need the chains of the past. It needs your full presence. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself every day that he should live as if he had already died and been granted an extension. That vision transforms time. There is no space to prolong ancient sufferings when you understand that every present moment is a unique gift. Reliving the past is wasting the life you still have. The suffering you choose to prolong is, in reality, a strange refuge. It keeps you occupied, it gives you a narrative, it offers you a motive. But at the same time, it robs you of the only thing you have, life in this moment. Clinging to the past is like carrying an invisible corpse. No one sees it, but you feel it at every step, and each day it grows heavier. True freedom begins when you allow yourself to let go. It does not mean forgetting or denying, but accepting. Accepting that it already happened, that it has already run its course, that nothing will change what was, and above all, accepting that you have the right to live without continuing to bleed for what has already ended. Stoicism does not deny the initial pain, but it invites you not to be its prisoner. Remember, you cannot avoid the pain of the past, but you can avoid prolonging it into your present. The suffering you choose to relive is suffering you choose to carry, and every day you carry it, you give up the peace you could have. Do not prolong the pain that has already ended. Let the scars be witnesses of what you lived, not chains that prevent you from moving forward. Learn the lesson, be grateful for what you still have, and keep going, because life does not stop for what you lost. Life is still waiting for you to awaken to the present. Seventh Stoic lesson: attachment to suffering steals your freedom. Suffering, when it arrives, strikes with force, but the real danger is not only in the initial pain, but in the attachment we create toward it. Because clinging to suffering is like embracing a chain. The more you hold it, the deeper it cuts into your skin. And although it may seem paradoxical, many prefer to carry those chains rather than let them go. Why? Because suffering, painful as it is, gives a strange sense of identity, of familiarity, of belonging. Letting it go requires stepping into the unknown, and the unknown is frightening. Attachment to suffering manifests in many ways. There are those who, after a failure, refuse to try again, saying, "I don't want to suffer again." In reality, what happens is that they remain attached to that first pain, feeding it in their memory, repeating the story over and over again. Others, after a betrayal, build their entire lives around distrust, as if betrayal were happening every day. They live tied to an experience that has already ended, but still rules their present. The Stoics knew, freedom does not begin when life stops hurting, but when we stop depending on pain to define us. Epictetus, who knew well the physical chains of slavery, taught that true slavery is internal, being ruled by what you cannot let go, and nothing rules more than a suffering you cling to. Imagine someone who, every time they speak of themselves, does so in terms of their wounds. I, the one who was deceived. I, the one who never had opportunities. I, the one who always loses. That attachment to suffering becomes a life narrative, and when a narrative is repeated often enough, it becomes destiny, not because the world dictates it, but because one chose it by not releasing the chain. Marcus Aurelius expressed it in his Reflections. What prevents you from living in the present is not fate, but your opinion of what has happened. The emperor, surrounded by wars, illnesses, and betrayals, understood that attachment to those pains would make him a prisoner in his own mind. That is why he practiced acceptance, seeing what happened as past, seeing the present as opportunity, and letting go of what no longer had real power. Attachment to suffering steals freedom in several ways. First, it steals your freedom to think clearly. When you are clinging to pain, you see everything through it. The mind becomes clouded, interpreting every gesture, every word, every opportunity through the wound. Second, it steals your freedom to choose. For those who cling to suffering do not choose freely, they choose conditionally. I won't take risks because I once failed. I won't trust because I was betrayed. Third, it steals your freedom to enjoy. Because even in moments of peace, the chain of pain reminds you that you don't deserve tranquility, that you must always return to the dark place. Attachment to suffering is, at its core, fear disguised as loyalty. You believe that letting go of pain is betraying yourself, as if accepting healing meant forgetting your story. But it is not so. Letting go is not denial. Letting go is not erasure. Letting go is liberation. The wound will remain part of your biography, but it will not own you. In practice, how is this attachment broken? First, by recognizing that it exists, ask yourself, what pain am I still feeding in my mind even though it is no longer happening? What story do I repeat every time I need to justify my passivity, my fear, or my distrust? Naming the attachment is the first step to weakening it. Second, practice the discipline of replacing the narrative. When your mind drags you to the memory of your wound, replace it with a present action. If you recall a betrayal, don't repeat the story. Write down what you learned from it. If you recall a failure, don't relive the fall. Take a small step toward a new attempt. Each action in the present cuts a thread of the chain that ties you to the past. Third, cultivate virtue as your new identity. Attachment to suffering is born from defining yourself by what you endured. Breaking it requires redefining yourself by what you practice. Seneca said that true merit lies in living with serenity, not in counting how many pains you endured. So stop presenting yourself as a victim and start presenting yourself as a learner, as someone who builds themselves from virtue. Think of someone who, after years of mourning, finally decides to laugh without guilt. That moment is a declaration of freedom. They have not forgotten the one they lost, but they stopped being a slave to pain, or of someone who, after a betrayal, allows themselves to trust again, not because they ignore the risk, but because they understand that living in perpetual fear is another form of death. Those simple acts are the true victories over attachment to suffering. Marcus Aurelius insisted that life is far too short to waste it on invisible chains. Fate will already bring us inevitable trials, illness, loss, old age. We do not need to add to those trials the unnecessary weight of clinging to pain. Freedom, he said, is not achieved by eliminating all suffering, but by eliminating the need to cling to it. Suffering may touch you, but it has no right to rule you. That is your choice. Every time you choose to relive the pain, you choose to surrender your freedom. Every time you choose to let it go, you choose to reclaim it. And that decision, though small, is the greatest one you can make. Do not forget this. Past suffering exists only in your memory. If you remain chained to it, it is not because life imposes it, but because you feed it. And as long as you feed it, you will never be free. True strength is not in holding chains, but in breaking them. Attachment to suffering steals your freedom. Letting go returns it to you. Do not fear losing your identity by releasing it, because what you truly lose is not your story, but your slavery, and what you recover is far more valuable. The ability to live fully in the present, without invisible chains dictating your steps. Eighth Stoic lesson: the mind creates more pain than reality. There is a type of suffering that does not come from what happens, but from what we imagine might happen. The mind, with its infinite capacity to create scenarios, is capable of fabricating storms even on clear days. We replay an offense again and again, recreate losses that have not yet happened, anticipate misfortunes that may never arrive. And so, we live more in the anguish of what is imagined than in the harshness of what is real. Seneca warned with precision, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." That phrase, so brief, contains an entire universe, because if we honestly analyze our pain, we discover that much of it does not come from the present, but from thoughts that spin in circles in our heads. The mind multiplies what life only presented once. Imagine a discussion. The harsh words were spoken in an instant. The fact, objective, lasted only a few minutes. But in your mind, that scene repeats 100 times. The offense is heard again every night. You mentally respond with what you did not say. You imagine new humiliations that never occurred. The reality has already passed, but your mind relives it in a loop, turning a single blow into 100. That excess was not imposed by life. You created it. The same happens with fear of the future. We fear losing our job. We fear getting sick. We fear that something terrible will happen to our loved ones. And in the meantime, those fears live in the mind as if they were real. Life requires us to face pains when they arrive, but we suffer them twice, once in reality and 1,000 times in imagination. It is like carrying a double sentence for a single event. The Stoics proposed training the mind to distinguish between what is real and what is imagined. Epictetus taught, "It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about them." An opinion is an interpretation, a judgment, an added thought. And most of the time, that addition is what multiplies the pain. It is not the illness that hurts as much as the anticipated fear of illness. It is not the loss that destroys, but the infinite mourning recreated in memory. Marcus Aurelius, who faced wars and epidemics, reminded himself every day that the only real thing was what he had before him in that moment. The future was uncertain, and the past was already out of his power. What remained was the present, naked, without mental additions. And there, in that reduced space, suffering was more bearable because it was not multiplied by imagination. The pain created by the mind is insidious because it seems justified. We believe that by anticipating a problem we are preparing ourselves. We believe that by remembering an offense we are protecting ourselves from future wounds. But in reality, all we are doing is adding unnecessary weight to a life that is already heavy enough. The mind is not content with a single pain. It repeats it, decorates it, exaggerates it. And in that excess, it wears us down. Think of a daily example. Someone is waiting for a medical result. The test has already been done, but the answer has not yet arrived. For days, that person imagines scenarios, the worst illness, painful treatments, a devastated future. Their mind lives an immense suffering before knowing the truth. When the result arrives and they discover that everything is fine, they breathe with relief. But all that previous suffering was created by their imagination. It was not real, but they lived it as if it were. In daily life, this mechanism happens at every moment. When we think our friends are judging us, when we believe a look is contempt, when we anticipate that a project will fail before even trying it. All those pains do not exist outside our mind. Reality is one, interpretation is multiple. And interpretation can be hell if we do not control it. How is the Stoic teaching applied here? The first step is to distinguish between fact and opinion. The fact is what happened. I was fired from my job. The opinion is what we add. I will never get another job. I am a failure. Everything is lost. The fact is hard, but objective. The opinion, on the other hand, can multiply the pain until it becomes unbearable. The Stoic trains his mind to separate both planes. The second step is to practice the present. The mind, by anticipating or remembering, abandons the now and gets lost in imaginary worlds. The Stoic brings back his attention to the immediate, the breath, the task at hand, the concrete action he can take today. The present, though sometimes difficult, is more bearable than the imaginary chains of the future or the past. The third step is to accept uncertainty. Much of mental suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. We want to know in advance what will happen. We want to have certainties where there are only probabilities. And since we cannot, the mind fills with dark scenarios. The Stoic learns to live with that uncertainty, remembering that the only thing under his control is the virtue with which he responds, not the events that will come. The pain created by the mind is also fought with perspective. Marcus Aurelius recommended looking at problems from above, as if you were observing life from the immensity of the cosmos. From that height, many of the anxieties become small, almost insignificant. What seemed unbearable is reduced to a brief instant in eternity. The mind, by changing perspective, diminishes its capacity to create suffering. Remember this. Life already brings enough real pain without adding invented sufferings. You do not need to multiply your wounds with unnecessary thoughts. Every time your mind takes you to a dark scenario that has not yet occurred, remind yourself, this is not real, it is only a thought. That short phrase deactivates the power of imaginary pain. Real suffering is inevitable. The wound, the loss, death, all of that is part of destiny. But the suffering created by the mind is avoidable. It is optional. It depends on you. The difference between the two marks the boundary between slavery and inner freedom. Do not forget, much of what hurts you is not happening in life, but in your head. And when you understand that, you will hold in your hands one of the most powerful keys to Stoic serenity. Ninth Stoic lesson. Dignity is found in acceptance. Acceptance is not surrender. That is one of the most common confusions. We believe that accepting pain, loss, or difficulty means lowering our arms, ceasing to fight, resigning ourselves to defeat. But Stoicism teaches something else. To accept is to understand the difference between what depends on you and what does not, and to choose with serenity where to place your energy. Acceptance is not a gesture of weakness, but of wisdom, and in that wisdom lies true dignity. Suffering multiplies when we resist the inevitable. Think of someone who, faced with an incurable illness, spends their days fighting reality, asking why it happened to them, cursing their fate. Their pain is real, but resistance makes it even heavier. Now think of someone who, in the same situation, accepts what cannot be changed and decides to live with intensity every day that remains. That act is not surrender, it is dignity. Marcus Aurelius expressed it clearly. Do not wish that things happen as you desire, but desire that they happen as they do, and your life will flow serenely. It is not about conformism, but about aligning yourself with reality instead of fighting against it eternally. Acceptance means saying, "This is what can I do with it?" That attitude is what transforms suffering into strength. The problem is that we confuse acceptance with passivity, but acceptance does not mean staying still. Accepting that you lost a job does not mean you stop looking for another one. Accepting that someone left does not mean you stop loving. Accepting that you made a mistake does not mean you stop improving. Acceptance means ceasing to waste energy on the impossible, changing what has already happened or what is beyond your control, and directing all your strength toward what you can do now. The dignity of acceptance manifests itself in small gestures. A person who smiles in the midst of adversity, not because they ignore the pain, but because they accept it. A father who accompanies his sick child with calmness, without collapsing, because he knows his serenity is more useful than his despair. A woman who, after being abandoned, decides to rebuild herself without hatred, accepting that what happened does not define her worth. In all these cases, acceptance is not surrender, it is inner strength. Epictetus taught it from experience. He was a slave for much of his life, and yet he never allowed that condition to define him as a victim. He accepted the reality of his chains, but did not give them power over his spirit. That acceptance did not make him weak, but invincible, because no one can take away the inner freedom of someone who has learned to accept the inevitable. Rejecting reality, on the other hand, makes us its slaves. Those who do not accept what already is live in constant war with ghosts. They cling to what should have happened, to what never came, to what was lost. That struggle changes nothing. It only multiplies the pain. It is like trying to stop the sea with your hands. Useless, exhausting, despairing. Acceptance does not eliminate the wave, but teaches you to ride it. In practice, how do you cultivate this Stoic acceptance? First, with the exercise of clarity. Always ask yourself, does this depend on me or not? If it depends on you, act with all your strength. If it does not depend on you, accept it calmly. That distinction is the core of Stoicism. Second, change the language with which you face life. Instead of saying, "This should not have happened," say, "This happened, what will I do now?" The change is subtle, but it transforms your relationship with reality. The first statement chains you to frustration. The second opens you to action. Third, practice gratitude even in adversity. Acceptance does not mean that everything is perfect. It means that you recognize that even in the midst of pain, there is something to be grateful for. That gratitude does not erase the wound, but it illuminates it. Marcus Aurelius gave thanks every day for waking up, even when he knew the empire awaited him with wars and betrayals. Gratitude is an act of acceptance, embracing what you have instead of crying over what is missing. The dignity of acceptance is also seen in the way we face death, the greatest inevitability of all. The Stoic does not deny it or obsessively fear it. He accepts it as part of life, as the common destiny of all. By accepting it, he stops living enslaved by fear and begins to live the present with greater intensity. The final dignity of a man is measured in how he faces the inevitable, and there is no greater inevitable than death. Acceptance does not mean loving pain, but ceasing to resist it uselessly. It means looking it in the face, acknowledging it, learning what it brings, and then moving on. Acceptance gives you back the freedom to act on what is in your hands. Dignity is not in fighting the impossible, but in walking serenely in the midst of the inevitable. Remember this, life will not always ask for your permission. Losses, failures, injustices will come. You will not be able to avoid them all, but you will be able to decide how to respond. And that response, when it comes from acceptance, gives you back the peace that resistance steals from you. Dignity is found in acceptance, because to accept is to choose serenity over despair, action over complaint, freedom over inner slavery. And those who learn to accept, even when life strikes them, never lose their greatness. 10th Stoic lesson. True strength is living without chains. Most people confuse strength with the ability to endure pain. They believe that the strong person is the one who endures the most, who sacrifices in silence, who carries wounds without complaint. But Stoicism teaches something else. True strength does not lie in accumulating suffering, but in freeing oneself from the chains that bind it. Enduring pain without reason is not greatness, it is slavery. Breaking the addiction to suffering and regaining the freedom to choose, that is strength. Marcus Aurelius said that the soul is degraded when it lets itself be dragged by what it cannot control. And few things degrade more than living chained to unnecessary suffering, because there are pains that arrive inevitably, but there are others that we keep alive out of habit, fear, or custom. And those pains become invisible chains that prevent us from living with serenity. The strong are not those who bear heavy chains, but those who dare to break them. Imagine someone who, after a betrayal in love, decides never to trust again. On the surface, they may seem strong. No one will hurt me again, they say firmly. But in reality, they live chained to a past wound, limiting their ability to love. That is not strength, it is prison. Instead, the one who accepts what happened, learns from it, and opens up again to the possibility of love, that person is truly strong, because they had the courage to break the chain and choose freedom. The same principle applies to failure. Some turn their falls into chains they drag for life. Every new attempt is judged by the memory of what went wrong. They prefer not to risk, not to dream, not to move, and they call it prudence, but in reality it is fear. The Stoic understands that failing is part of the path, but chaining oneself to that failure is a choice. Strength lies in trying again, not in remaining immobile under the weight of what already happened. Seneca taught that the one enslaved by passions, fears, or memories is not free. True freedom is interior, being able to choose your attitude, your response, your path. And to reach it, you must break the chains that bind you to suffering. It is not enough to resist, you must free yourself. It is not enough to endure, you must let go. Attachment to suffering may feel like strength because it requires resistance, but that resistance is deceptive. It is like a prisoner proud of enduring years in his cell. Does that make him free? True greatness is not in enduring chains, but in having the courage to break them and walk out of prison. In daily life, these chains take many forms: the resentment you don't let go of, the guilt you carry, the painful story you repeat over and over, the fear of making mistakes that paralyzes you. Each one is an invisible chain that robs you of freedom. Strength is not in continuing to carry them, but in having the courage to let them go, even if that means stepping into the unknown. Epictetus knew this well. Having lived as a slave, he understood that the strongest chains were not made of iron, but the ones one places in their own mind. They could bind his body, but they could not force him to live with hatred or despair. His strength was in choosing his inner freedom, even in the worst circumstances. That lesson still holds true. No one can chain you if you choose not to be chained. In practice, how do you break these chains? The first step is to identify them. Ask yourself, what suffering do I keep alive unnecessarily? What thought do I repeat that keeps me from moving forward? What fear paralyzes me, even though it no longer has any foundation? Naming the chain is the beginning of liberation. The second step is to consciously decide to let go. Letting go is not forgetting overnight, nor denying what happened. Letting go is choosing not to feed the memory with your energy anymore. It is ceasing to repeat the wound as if it were happening every day. It is recognizing that it already passed, that you cannot change it, and that the only thing you have is the present. The third step is to replace the chain with virtue. Marcus Aurelius insisted that the mind cannot remain empty. If you do not occupy it with thoughts of serenity, it will fill with ghosts. That is why it is not enough to stop feeding suffering. You must actively cultivate virtue. Patience, gratitude, courage, discipline. Each practiced virtue is a broken link in the chain. True strength is not measured by how much pain you can endure, but by how much freedom you are capable of conquering. Unnecessary suffering is not proof of character, it is proof of addiction. Freeing yourself from it is the greatest act of courage, because living without chains requires more bravery than continuing to drag them. Imagine the moment you decide to leave behind a resentment you have carried for years. Suddenly, you breathe lighter. The other person did not change. What changed was your inner freedom. That moment is pure strength. Or when you choose to forgive yourself for past mistakes and stop living in eternal guilt. That act does not make you weak, it makes you strong, because you have broken the chain that kept you bound to yesterday. Remember, anyone can suffer, but not everyone can be free. Anyone can endure, but not everyone can let go. Anyone can chain themselves to pain, but the wise turn it into a school and then move on. That is the difference between the one who merely survives and the one who lives with greatness. True strength is living without chains, and that freedom is not granted by fate, circumstances, or luck. That freedom is conquered within you every time you choose not to cling to suffering, every time you break an invisible chain, every time you choose virtue over the wound. We have walked a difficult but necessary path. We named one of life's most silent prisons, the addiction to suffering. That invisible tendency that binds us to memories, guilt, fears, and wounds that should no longer govern us. An addiction that robs us of peace, that conditions our decisions, and that, without realizing it, makes us accomplices of our own pain. Suffering is inevitable. No one can avoid losses, betrayals, disappointments, illnesses, or death. That is part of the human condition. But what is not inevitable is continuing to cling to those wounds once their time has passed. What is not inevitable is turning pain into identity, into habit, into refuge. That is the trap we have dismantled today. Unnecessary suffering, the one we choose to relive without reason, the one that enslaves us more than any blow of fate. The Stoics were clear. Life is not measured by what you suffer, but by the virtue with which you respond, and that is the key. Great is not the one who accumulates wounds as medals, nor the one who makes of his pain a spectacle, nor the one who prides himself on enduring more than others. Great is the one who transforms suffering into wisdom, who accepts the inevitable without despair, who knows how to let go of what has already ended, who does not cling to the invisible chains of the past. Imagine for a moment your life without that addiction to pain. Think about what it would be like to wake up without reliving every offense, without anticipating every disaster, without repeating every failure as if it were your destiny. Think about the freedom of relating without fear, of trying without carrying the weight of "I already failed," of living each moment without your mind contaminating it with unnecessary memories and fears. That life is not utopia, it is within reach of your decision. Breaking the addiction to suffering does not mean you will never feel pain again. It means that you will stop making pain your master, that you will learn to receive it when it comes, but also to let it go when it has served its purpose. That you will know how to distinguish between useful suffering, which strengthens you, and useless suffering, which only destroys you. And that every day you will remember that true strength is not in enduring chains, but in living without them. Marcus Aurelius said, "The life of a man is what his thoughts make of it." If your thoughts feed on suffering, your life will be suffering. But if you choose to cultivate thoughts of virtue, serenity, freedom, your life will reflect that choice. In the end, you are what you decide to hold in your mind, and no one can make that decision for you. Today you have a choice in your hands: to continue carrying pains that are already over, or to let go of those chains and begin to live with dignity. No one can do it in your place. You are the guardian of your mind. You are the one who decides whether suffering will be your prison or your teacher, and that choice, small as it may seem, defines your entire existence. Suffering, when it becomes addiction, robs you of the most valuable thing you have, your freedom. But if you choose to break it, you regain the ability to live with clarity, to love without fear, to act without chains. That is the life Stoicism proposes. Not a life without pain, but a life without enslavement to pain. A life in which serenity does not depend on what happens, but on what you choose to think. And here is my final invitation. If this message resonated with you, if you felt that one of these lessons spoke directly to your story, do not let it pass as just another reflection. Make this a turning point. Decide today which chains you will let go of. Decide today which sufferings no longer deserve your energy. Decide today that your dignity will be stronger than your wound. I want you to write in the comments a phrase that marks your commitment to this decision. Write it not only for yourself, but also as a public declaration, as a reminder of your own strength. The mantra is simple but powerful. I am stronger than my suffering. I choose my freedom. Write those words. Return them to your mind every time the addiction to pain tries to drag you back. Make them your shield, your reminder, your new habit. Because if suffering can become a habit, freedom can too. And when you make freedom your habit, nothing and no one can chain you. If this journey gave you value, subscribe and join me in the next reflections, not only to listen, but to walk together toward a stronger, more serene and freer life. Your pain is not your identity. Your freedom, your virtue, and your inner peace are, and that is the path that begins now. Your voice is essential here. Every reflection strengthens and elevates our community, reflecting the true value of each individual and contributing to our shared Stoic identity. The reflection that receives the most support will be pinned as the banner of this community of Stoic minds. A community that does not run from pain, but passes through it with courage, with wisdom, with honor. See you in our next meeting at Stoicism for Winners, where we will continue exploring the riches of Stoic wisdom applied to modern life. Now, take the opportunity to deepen in Stoicism with new recommended podcast sessions. Follow us so you don't miss any reflection that could help you just at the moment you feel overwhelmed. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday we publish episodes designed to accompany you when life weighs heavy, when it is hard to stay calm, when you need a word to remind you who you are. Not following us is risking missing just that lesson that could give you back the peace you've been searching for. Until we meet again, remember, you are the sole owner of your perception, the creator of your peace, and the warrior of your own battle. This is the legacy of Stoicism, the art of being invincible.